You ever thought my slides weren't exciting enough? I hope you're happy now. Okay, look at that. The goal is to get from Angular to a web API written in ASP.NET Core, and then from there into a SQL Server database. And the idea is to do this quickly by using the code generators I have available here. Visual Studio comes with a template that has Angular integrated with ASP.NET Core Web API, but it doesn't connect to a database. Plus, I like to develop Angular as a separate project. So we're going to do this two ways. And first, I'm going to use the project that's created by Visual Studio, which has Angular and ASP.NET Web API all in one project. And when we use that, Angular gets delivered to the browser as a single page application. And then when the user does something, an HTTP request goes to our web API, and then it gets the information it needs from the database through Entity Framework Core, and then delivers back a JSON response. From there, Angular can display the contents of the JSON. Visual Studio integrates Angular and ASP.NET Web API through SPA services. And then after that, I'm going to separate Angular into a separate project. Once I do that, I'm going to use Visual Studio Code to edit the project. Now in this situation, Angular and our web API are on two different domains. Now they both look like localhost, but they have different port numbers. So that may be an issue, and you'll see how we deal with that. Just as a hint, we're going to use cores and environment variables. So here's a timeline of what I plan to do here. First, we're going to create a Visual Studio project, get that running, and then I'm going to create a database with a table, and then from that I can use Visual Studio to generate a module and a DB context, and then from that DB context I can generate a controller. Now at that point we need to convert the DB context into a service so that we can inject it as a dependency into the controller. Then at that point we're about halfway through the project. And from there we'll develop a separate Angular project, and then get it to do a web API request. At that point it's going to require a fix to use cores. And then from there, I'm going to clean up the HTTP request so that it uses HTTP client instead of HTTP module. I'll get back to showing this halfway through the project. Now, how do I do this quickly? Well, it's because I'm using a lot of the code generators that are available to me. Visual Studio, when you create a new project, it puts Angular and ASP.NET Web API together in a project using this SPA services. And then I can use Scaffold DB context, which is part of the Entity Framework Core tooling. Once we get to creating a separate Angular project, we can use the Angular CLI to create a new Angular project. For this demo, this is the software I'm going to use. Well, I'll just let you read it. And I'll show this again at the end of the project. And all this is from scratch. So we're going to create a new project. This is an ASP.NET Core web application. And we're going to include Angular, which, by the way, it is a bit like a web API. It includes a web API that also follows the model view controller design pattern. Okay, here we have it, and I'm just going to go right to starting it without debugging. That took considerably longer for me than it did for you. That took about 5 minutes. So here it is. If I click on fetch data, well, it looks like it's fetching data. Let's see if I click it again. Let's hit refresh. It says 44. And, 43 now. So what happened here? This weather forecast page. Well, what we can do is we can search for that term. I'm going to ignore everything that says dist on it, and this is the only one that doesn't here. So I'll click on that. And here it is, weather forecast. So we know this is the page that's displaying. And I can see from those find results that it's in, where is it? Client app, components, fetch data, component HTML. Client app, components, fetch data. Fetch data component HTML. That's that. And this is a template for a TypeScript page, which is sitting right next to it. So this is the page that's getting those results. And the way it's doing it is doing an HTTP GET to the API. And so we should be able to find that API. Once again, ignoring the dists. This is the TypeScript page I was just looking at. And so this is probably it here. And sure enough, we can see it says API. This controller that's in square brackets, what it's doing is it's using this class name without controller on it. So it's just using sample data. So it's API / sample data. And then here we have action in square brackets. That's the name of this method, weather forecasts. API sample data weather forecasts. API sample data weather forecasts. So that's it. So what's it doing here? Well, it's getting a random number, or it has a random object here, and it's using it for coming up with the temperature and a summary. So it has this list of potential summaries, and it uses a random number to pick one. So that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for a database. So let's make a database table out of this. I want the name of this table to match this interface. And I want the field names to match this interface. There, that looks good. Oh, now I have to insert the rows into that table. and to click here. Let's check. Yep, that's what we want. Now, from that table, I want to generate a model and a DB context, and I can do that by using this built-in console and entering this instruction here. Now, if you'd prefer to use a command prompt outside of Visual Studio, that's fine, except you may need to use a different instruction for that. But if you were to search scaffold DB context, you should be able to find it. Now the parameters are a connection string. I need a connection string here. And then what our driver is, in this case, it's, I'm just going to copy it, just so I'm sure I don't make a mistake here. So this is a SQL Server driver that's part of Entity Framework Core, and I want the results to go into the models folder, which we don't have yet. So it'll create that. Now we need our connection string. So if I go to the database and then view the properties, here's the connection string. Now that's way more than I need here. So I'm going to cut some of this out, and we're left with three parts. One is our server name, which I believe that Project V13 is kind of the default name for SQL Server 2016 because it's version 13. We also need the name of the database, which here it's called an initial catalog. And then we need to use integrated security equals true. So that should do it. All right, let's see what we got here. Oh, look at this. It opened up the sample data context for us. And it's in, and here's this models folder, sample data context, and here's weather forecast. Weather forecast. Those are the same set of fields. Now before we can run this, we need to add a controller for it. So we'll go into our controllers folder, add controller. This is an API controller with actions using Entity Framework. We're using our weather forecast and our sample data controller. There, now we have a controller, and you can see this, this is an API. Works similarly to the controller we were using before, except for hopefully we will get data from the database with this one. I'm just doing a build here. I don't need to run without debugging again, because that should be enough to get it running in the browser. So here's the same page if I do a refresh here. It's really just using the same fetch data that we had before. So you see 43 here. This is Postman, and it's going to do the API request just like the browser does using Angular. So what is the path again? Has the same base URL as the browser, but API / sample data / there's the data. I'm hitting the API directly, the web API directly. Okay, just like we did before, let's see if we can hit this API directly. Well, something's wrong here. I can see it says error, but I can't see what the error is. So let's just enter this into a browser. And the error is unable to resolve service for type sample data context. Okay, so this is a DB context. Basically, the error is unable to resolve service for type DB context. So the problem is we're building our connection right here on the onConfiguring method of this class, and that's really not allowed. The DB context needs to be injected into the class as a service. So what we need to do here is comment this out. So I'm going to inject the service before I've created the service, and then we'll create the service. And basically the purpose here, what we're trying to achieve here is pass the connection down to the base class. Okay, so now let's go create our service. That's done in startup.cs. Add DB context. Now, sample data context doesn't exist in here, so I'm going to use the quick actions to say use models. And the underline goes away, and here it is right here. I just added it. Services is still underlined because we haven't completed the instruction. Here we have a configuration object that we can use to add our connection string. Okay, this use SQL Server also doesn't exist. So we are going to use Microsoft Entity Framework Core. And that just got added right there. Now, I could just put my connection string right in here. But I don't want to do that. That's hard coding. So, how do we deal with that? We have to use this configuration object. That's really the best way to do that. And look at that, it has a get connection string method. And we're going to have a name for our connection string. So where is this connection string that says sample data, that's named sample data? Well, configuration gets data from a few different files, but the most convenient one here is appsettings.json. And when you add a connection string to it, you have to set it up just the right way. And what's our connection string? We'll just get it again from the database. And that should do it. Whoops, forgot one thing. Made our connection string, but I didn't put it in. Let's build and try again. There's the data. Now, how do we know, really? Let's try changing something in the database and see if it shows up. I'm going to change freezing to success. And let's refresh. Success. All right, so now we know our API is working. We just have to get it working in Angular. So we go back into our fetch data TypeScript and change the API. Here we go. There we go. And sure enough, success. So let's just review our timeline here. I created the Visual Studio project, created a database table, created our model and our DB context, and then from that I created a controller. Then we had to convert our data context into a service so that we could inject it as a dependency into our controller, and then we got Angular working. Now we're going to make Angular a separate project. So here's the folder that I'm going to create my Angular project in, and I'll get a command line for that. Now I already have Angular installed on this machine, so hopefully you do too. Okay, that also took 5 minutes. And now we have project sample data. Let's go in there. And let's run it. So it's listening on port 4200. So let's go there. There it is. So there you go, it's running. Got the application running. Now we need to get to the API. So I'm going to stop that service and open it up in Visual Studio Code. Okay, so here's the Angular project, and you can see some similarities in that it has an app folder with some components in it. Just like you see in here, app, components, and the code we're interested in is in this fetch data component TypeScript. And it has in here a constructor. This is the bit of code that does the HTTP GET and goes to the web API. And here is our app component. I'm just going to paste that in there. So let's clean up some of these red underlines here. And I'm not getting the proper import for this. I can copy it right from here. Angular HTTP, I should have known that, right? That red underline goes away. This is for getting this base URL. This depends on the SPA integration that's built into .NET. I could use it, but it's simpler for this demo to get rid of that. And let's make this a variable. And we could just enter our base URL right here, but I don't want to do hard coding of such a thing here. So we need like an environment variable. And Angular has this environments folder set up, and we could just put it in here. So what is our base URL? It's this thing. And then here you put all right, forecasts. What did we do wrong here? Well, in the other Angular project, we had this interface here. So I'll just copy that and post it in here, paste it in here. And still we have forecasts. We should have copied this over. Go into integrated terminal and enter npm start. Let's see what we get. Okay, we got an error here. Static injector. Okay, I know what that is. I forgot something. I forgot to put this into my module. All right, let's try it again. Okay, we have another failure here. No access control allow origin header. So let me explain this. It's hard to figure out from this. If you were to search Google for this, you would probably figure it out pretty quickly. But exactly what to do to fix this is not so clear. But basically the problem is that I'm trying to hit an API that's in a different domain than the domain of the website that Angular is running in. And browsers are set up to not allow that. And this is a restriction usually on the API, the web API side. So we need to modify the web API to provide this header. So I have to go to my ASP.NET project to do this. And this is part of what's called CORS. Startup. This will be a service. So we add CORS. This provides a configuration object that we can modify with a lambda. We're going to add a policy, and we have to give it a name. So I'm going to call it client domain. Here's another lambda. And here we'll put the origin that is allowed. I could hard code that domain name right in here, but I don't want to do that once again. So let's use our configuration. All right, so where's it getting that client domain from? appsettings.json. And what's that domain? We have that in the browser. I think we're not supposed to have that slash at the end. Okay, client domain. Let's stick that in here. Okay, so we've added the service. Now we have a few options on how to do this course operation, but I'm just picking one here to go with. So I'm sure if you look it up, you'll find lots of alternatives. So within our configure method, somewhere before use MVC, I'm going to stick it in here. Use course, and then I pass in the name. Okay, this time no errors, but we still don't see the data. And that's because we didn't put in the, we didn't add HTML to our template. So this is the template. There's a bunch of stuff in here I really don't care about, so I'm just going to delete it all. And if we go back to the page, you'll see a bunch of this stuff disappear. Welcome app. Okay, now let's go get our HTML. And we want this table, and we probably want to display a loading text if it hasn't loaded yet. Okay, let's see. And there's our data. So we're done. See, it says success. So it's pulling this data from the database, and now we're running with a separate Angular project. There is one last thing that I'd like to change here, because this HTTP GET is very central to what we're trying to do here. This is the thing that's calling the API. There's a lot that we're not doing here. I took a lot of shortcuts. For one thing, this interface should probably be in a separate file. We're not using any reactive-x as an observable. Usually what we're doing here is a separate service, and then you can use the service to get back an observable, and then you subscribe to that. But we're squeezing it all into one here just for convenience. One thing I can do, though, is I can change the HTTP library that I'm using here, because this isn't the latest library, and it just wasn't built with the latest library in the ASP.NET Core API. And now we have a red underline on JSON. That's because we can just get rid of this now. Okay, but we also have to change it in our module. Still showing an error here, though. Oh, there it goes. Okay, let's look at our web page again. And we still get the data. Okay. So, minor improvement, I'm sure you would say. That pretty much does it. Let's look at our timeline again. So what did we do here? We created a separate Angular project. We made a web API request. We had to use CORS in order to fix that. And then we switched from the HTTP module to HTTP client. And how were we able to do this so quickly? Was using the code generation in Visual Studio and the Angular CLI when I did ng-new. And then we also used Scaffold DB Context. The software that I had installed, here's a list of the software that I had installed. And that's it.